welcome to the February the 9th, 1987 taping of It Happened in Grand Prairie as we continue to bring you wonderful excerpts from the history long ago in Grand Prairie, Texas, and bringing you up to date on the happenings of our guests that are with us today. This is History Tape number 35, and we're very excited today to have a long-time resident of Grand Prairie, Texas, and Beth Ray Speck McLean. We're delighted to welcome you to the show today.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Now, Beth McLean, you've been very important to the history making of Grand Prairie, Texas. But before we let you tell about yourself a little bit more in detail of what's happening to you these days, we'd like for you to go back in history with us and maybe from the genealogy of your mother and father, tell us a little bit about the history, where they came from, all of the names that we can add to this wonderful history tape. Would you do that, and would you look right out into your camera?
All right. I think one of the most interesting things in my background, particularly to history buffs, is that my great-grandfather, along with Daniel Boone and 16 other families, moved and settled a little settlement on the Watauga River, which runs between Kentucky and Tennessee, and they named their little community Watauga. And my grandfather grew up in this little community, and as a grown man, he migrated to Texas in about 1755 and got land north of Fort Worth, where he made his own community, settled it, owned all of the property around, and he named it Watauga, the same as the one he had come from. And that settlement today is a little town of about 28,000 people.
All right, and it is still in North Tarrant County?
It's still north of Fort Worth, about 10 miles. In fact, I think they joined now.
All right, now that very famous grandfather, could you give us his name and the name of his wife with her maiden name, if you have that in your memory bank?
I have a picture of them
Wonderful.
somewhere.
All right. Would you hold that up
Yes.
right for the camera? I know they would like
That's
to see
Mary
that.
Jane and Houston Lafayette Speck.
All right.
And the little bitty one down here is my father, H.B. Speck.
All right. Now, your grandmother's name before she married Mr. Speck
Was Pickard. And the Pickards also live in Grand Prairie.
All right.
And some of them are still living here.
All right. Now, this grandfather was on your mother's or
No,
your
this
father's
was my
side?
father's side.
Your father's
Speck.
side. All right. Now, your grandfather that came to Watauga, how many children did he and your grandmother have other than your father?
6 other than my father.
All right.
And they all, except my father and one other brother, who moved to Grand Prairie, still live in Watauga. They've lived there all their lives.
And in the place that their grandfather settled.
Right.
Oh, that is so excellent.
And my mother went to Watauga to teach school, and there she met the young H.B. Speck, and they married in 1915 and moved to Idlewild.
Wonderful.
You know about Idlewild.
Oh, I know about Idlewild.
And she taught school there for 2 years. And then in, I believe it was 1920, they moved into Grand Prairie proper, and 6 months after I was born.
All right.
So-
I'd like to ask you about the Idlewild. When she was teaching at Idlewild, do you remember her principal of that school
No.
at that time? That's right.
It was before my day, and I'm sure I have heard it at some time or another, but I don't recall the name of the principal there.
All right. Now tell me about your mother's people. We know about the
All
Specks
right.
as they came to Watauga, and we
My-
know that she came as a school teacher. But where was she born, and where did she
She
migrate
came from Joshua, which is a small town just south of Fort Worth. And her father started out to be a school teacher, but he found he couldn't raise 6 children and a wife on a school teacher's salary. So he started designing and building houses.
Would you give
around
us his
Joshua.
name and his wife's full name?
Yes, his name, no, I can't even remember it.
That's
My grandmother was, he was R.L. Leonard, and his wife was Della Leonard.
all right.
And they were from Texas, but I don't know where until they moved to Joshua, where they originated, but in Texas.
How long did your parents live in the Watauga area before they came to Grand Prairie?
My father lived there until he married all his life, but my parents never lived in Watauga as a couple.
I see.
They moved to Idlewild when they married and lived there until they moved to Grand Prairie.
All right, now have you given us your parents' full name?
No, my mother's name was Cora Leonard Speck,
All right.
and my father was H.B. Speck.
And they
But
had how many
he was
children?
known as Phil, P-H-I-L, Phil Speck, because my mother met him in a play in Watauga, and his name was Phil in the play, and they played opposite each other, and she called him that until his death. He was always Uncle Phil to the nieces and nephews, and everyone except his own sisters called him that name.
All right, now, how many children did they have? And I know you're one.
I'm the oldest, and
All right.
I had one brother,
All right.
Don Speck.
Don Speck, all right. Can you tell us about your family, a little bit about your personal family? Now,
All right.
All right.
I have lived in Grand Prairie since I was 6 months old. I would say that's a pretty long time.
That's a long time.
I started working after finishing college in a bank here in Grand Prairie, and at that time was the only bank in town. And Timco started the, what is now LTV plant, and I met a young school teacher who came from Oklahoma. He was going to work here for the summer until he had to go back to teaching. And he found he made more money in that one summer working at Timco than he made 9 months teaching school, so it seemed rather silly to give it up and go back. So he remained here, and he was the 94th man hired at Timco, and he retired after 42 years with that same badge number.
Well, that is
94.
exciting. Number 94.
Number 94.
And you did not give us his magic name.
His magic name, Floyd Robert McLean.
All right. Now, you and Floyd Robert McLean married in what year?
Why did you ask me? Let's see. We just celebrated our 42nd anniversary
All right.
in 1st of January.
That ought to have been about in 1940 or 41 or 44?
45. I don't know.
45, that's a good year. Let's
That's
pick
as
that
good
one.
as any.
That's
If
as
they
good
really
as
want to know, they can subtract it and find out.
Right. And when you all married, did you settle in the Grand Prairie area?
Yes. We lived in Avion Village, which was the first, I think, apartment complex in Grand Prairie. And at that time, the plant was hiring many, many people, and there were no houses for them to live in, nor new married couples either. So I went to the grocery store where my father worked one day, and he said he had overheard a conversation that a man was moving out of Avion Village. And he said, why don't you run down there and see if you might get their apartment? And I did. And I met Romy Stewart, who is still living in Grand Prairie. And she said, well, we have a long waiting list. And I said, well, if I paid 2 months' rent in advance, would that help any? And I got the apartment, but we didn't have any furniture. And during the war, you know, you couldn't buy furniture that had metal springs, or you couldn't buy white fabric. And we got an old table that my brother had been using for an architect's table and refinished it. Bought unfinished chairs and finished them ourselves. And as a wedding gift, an aunt who worked at a furniture store in Fort Worth gave us a divan, and Mother and Daddy gave us a bedroom suite, and we moved into our new apartment.
That's wonderful. Could you tell me, what did Mr. McLean do at Timco Vault? What was his line of work?
He was an inspector and was foreman, and had about 75 men working for him at the time.
In his inspection work, he inspected the parts and the planes and
He
et cetera?
inspected the parts that made what do you call them? The patterns, in other words. And it had to have his stamp on it or they would not be made.
That's very exciting. Now, you mentioned what your husband did for a living. Now, we need to go back. Tell me what your father did for a living when he came to Grand Prairie, Texas, down in this area.
Well, since his father had had the only general store in Watauga as a child, he had helped work in that store. And so his line of work was working in grocery stores. And he started working for J.D. Gentry grocery store here in Grand Prairie. And worked for them until 1929, when the crash came and Mr. Gentry closed his store. And then my father worked in Dallas in a grocery store until C.R. Sargent opened his grocery store in Grand Prairie. And he worked there until his death.
All right, now, I would like to know the location approximately today of the Gentry grocery store so we can get that into our history.
All right, it was on the corner where Zales jewelry store and about half of Miller drugstore.
In that area.
In that area. And it was more or less a general store. It was called a grocery store, but they also sold farm and garden tools, fabrics and shoes, lace and so forth.
Was this before or after Mr. G.H. Turner had a hardware store in that area and the funeral home in the back? Are you knowledgeable about that?
I am not, no.
All right. Okay. Well, that lets us know what your dad did for a living. Did your mother work out of the home in any way?
My mother taught school for 51 years. She graduated from high school and the next year started teaching high school math. Was 1 year older than her students.
Where did she begin her teaching career?
In Joshua, yes, and then from there to Watauga.
To Watauga.
And she taught in Grand Prairie for 30 years.
And what area did she teach in Grand Prairie? Was it in Grand Prairie proper?
Grand Prairie
or
proper,
Iowa?
when all of the school was in one building from first grade through high school. And she started out in the 5th grade. And at that same year, I was in the 5th grade, so I had to have my mother as a school teacher. And the next year, of course, I left. But by the time my brother got to the 5th grade, she was back in the 5th grade again and followed him. She taught him in the 5th, 6th, and 7th grades.
So he had a good
And so
background, didn't he?
That's why he was valedictorian when he graduated, probably.
Wonderful. All right, now, Beth, we've followed your mother's career and your dad's career. Now, tell us about your young days in Grand Prairie, Texas, about the schools that you attended, and we know that probably there was just one then, but tell us maybe some of your favorite teachers, tell us your principal, tell us something about your activities as a young student.
Well, I did go through Grand Prairie School, and it was all, as I say, in one building. The year I graduated, they built a new auditorium, and we were the first class to get to graduate in that auditorium.
And what was your graduating class date?
1937, and would you like to see us as we looked in
Yes,
1937?
I would like to see that picture of the class of 1937, if you have that available. I think that's very exciting and if you would hold that where our camera can
It's
get that
shiny,
without a
can
glare
they?
on it. I believe they could, and you're all in cap and gown, and isn't that exciting? And I guess we could count those and tell how many was in your class, couldn't we?
They're 25.
And who was the valedictorian of your class?
I'm not even sure.
That's all right. We don't need to know that.
Since
do
it was not I
we? You didn't put that in your memory bank,
I didn't
did
put
you?
that in my memory bank.
Do you have anything else about school
Yes,
you'd like
I
to
do.
tell?
Can you see this one?
I believe we could see this one. What?
This was first grade,
First grade.
and Ressie Motley was my teacher at that time. And I'm not sure how many were in it.
That's very exciting. All right. Now, you've mentioned your brother Don Speck. Is he still living?
No, he is deceased.
You lost him?
As a very young man.
All right.
He graduated from Grand Prairie and went on and received his degree in architecture at the what?
Texas Tech?
Texas University at Austin.
All right.
And from there, he went to Birmingham, England, and did graduate work for 2 years there. And then he came back and was Trammell Crow's first private architect and worked for him for about 10 years. And then he went to work for the Presbyterian Church, United States, as an architect consultant for the whole church.
That is very
throughout
exciting.
the United States.
That's wonderful, isn't it? I'm sorry we lost that young man. All right, now, Beth, we've talked about your mother and father, your brother, and etc. Now we'd like to get down to your children and hear something about the children that have been born to you and Mr. McLean.
All right, we had 2 daughters, Donna and Kay, and they both fortunately still live in Grand Prairie. I'm very glad that I have them so close at hand. And the oldest one is a school teacher, following in the steps of her father and her grandmother.
All right, would you give us her full
And
name so we can identify her on our
All
history
right.
tape?
She is Donna McLean Peacock, and she teaches at Sam Rayburn Elementary School, the 5th grade.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And this is her 17th year to be there. And the youngest daughter is Kay McLean, and she works for the Federal Reserve Bank in Dallas in the research department.
All right, now do you and Mr. McLean have any grandchildren?
We have 3 grandchildren, David Peacock, Susan Peacock, and Shelley Peacock.
All right, now we must know where they go to school and their ages. Why don't you give us that?
All right. David is married, lives in Arlington, and is about to be a father.
Wonderful.
So I'll be a great-grandmother.
Wonderful.
And Susan is grown and has an apartment in Arlington. And Shelley still lives at home
Wonderful.
and will graduate this next year.
All right, now, Beth Ray, since you have finished high school now, you've married, and you have this lovely, lovely family, we'd like to know what has happened to your life in these later years. Did you retire from the bank and then go into any other field?
Yes, I worked in 2 banks in Grand Prairie,
All right,
total of about 21 years.
all right.
And then I say I retired. I really didn't retire. I just quit work because my husband had retired and we wanted to do things together.
All right.
And then he became ill 4 years ago, and I had to settle down and quit running around so much and take care of him. And I decided to write a book. Everybody else was writing one, so why shouldn't I try? And so I wrote it on my personal experiences in the bank. Just funny things that happen that you never think of as happening in a bank, and my philosophy on life. Live today. That's all you have.
That's wonderful. And this wonderful book that you're writing, when will it be completed? And are you going to publish it? And
It is being published now and will be out, I think, in April. And I would like to have anybody in Grand Prairie that would like to hear the history of background history of Grand Prairie and my philosophy, it will be on sale at First National Bank or First City National Bank in Grand Prairie, or by me. And the title is Today is Unlimited Cash.
Today is Unlimited Cash.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I love that.
It takes in a part of what I think, and with a background of banking, but that's about all I've done.
Well,
work and raise a family.
All right, now you mentioned living in Avion Village during the war years. Now, after you moved from Avion Village, apparently you did, what direction did you and your little family go?
We moved south on Prairie Street, and both of our children were born there. And then from there we moved to Danish, and we have lived on Danish Drive for 27 years.
All right, now where did your children attend school?
I don't even, at Bowie.
At Bowie?
Both of them went to Bowie.
Good.
And
from there to
from
Lee?
there they went to, I don't know what.
Is it Lee Middle School?
Lee Middle School,
And then on to
North Grand Prairie High School.
And then on to Grand Prairie High School. In all of those years that they were in school, were you in the PTA and any kind of club?
Yes, I was in PTA, and I have belonged to a lot of clubs in Grand Prairie. The 20th Century Study Club.
All right.
And the Rajabian Book Club. The Heart Association, the Cancer Society, the Chamber of Commerce. That's about all I think that I have worked in.
Have you ever been
office.
involved in the city commissions or committees or the school board or anything?
No.
Nothing to that effect?
No, none to that.
All right. All right, now tell us about your life in early Grand Prairie. What did you all do for entertainment? Did you go to church and all of these things?
Yes, we attended church, and
Would you tell us where?
Yes, I belong to the Trinity Presbyterian Church, which is a small, family-oriented church, and I have done church work, taught both adult classes and children's classes, and have been on the finance committee. They think because you work in a bank, you're supposed to know about money, but money was the farthest thing from what I ever did in a bank. I really had nothing to do with that, but I did serve on the finance committee.
All right, now you mentioned the bank. What did you do in the bank? What were your activities?
When I started work in the bank, I started at the very bottom as a bookkeeper, and I worked my way up to the loan department, was secretary to a loan officer, and then I did the bookkeeping in the loan department, all of it, and from there I became assistant vice president of the bank and in charge of all public relations and marketing in the bank.
All right, now you mentioned that you worked at the very and only bank that was in Grand Prairie
State Bank.
And who was the president of that bank at the time you began work there? Was it Mr. Bingham or Mr. Turner?
Mr. Bingham.
Mr. Bingham. And you worked with Mr. Bingham, and name drop some of the others that worked with you in that bank, like Mr. Avery and some of the others that we want.
Mr. Avery was the vice president when I was there, and Barley Bingham was in high school, but he would come in and help in the afternoons.
All right.
And let me think, Moore, her name is Moore now, married one of the Moore boys, at the funeral home in Dallas. I can't think of what her name was. Bean.
Kathleen Bean?
Kathleen Bean.
Kathleen Bean Moore?
We both were single, and one afternoon, I think we were tired because the hours were long when it was the only bank in town. And around 8 o'clock at night, we decided that we had to have some excitement, and we started singing. And then we decided that wasn't exciting enough, and we had found some black chewing gum somewhere and stuck it all over our front teeth, and in walked the bank examiners while we were singing with our teeth all blacked out in front. So you know they had good bookkeepers back then.
They certainly did, and I just wondered if you got to stay after that incident, and I'm sure you did.
Yes, I did.
Wonderful. Now, Beth Ray, I'd like you to tell us a little bit about going away to college, where you went and what you studied.
All right, I went to Arlington, was TCU, no?
NTAC?
NTAC.
All right.
When I first went to school, I went there for 2 years, and I majored in speech, believe it or not.
Wonderful.
And from there, I went to Texas Women's University and continued majoring in speech, but I decided that people couldn't make a living in speech, so I better take a little typing and shorthand to go along with it. And but do you know, it was my speech that got me my job, because I found that regardless of what job you are going into, you have to sell yourself. And it was through that I
That you were able to project.
able to sell myself and go on in a field that I really found I liked.
Well, knowing full well that your mother was a teacher and that she influenced your life quite a great deal, were there any other teachers that maybe gave you that spark to, and especially the speech, choosing that as a major? What made you make that choice?
I did not want to be a school teacher. Having lived with one, I knew that school teaching doesn't stop at the end of school. There are papers to grade, parents to contend with, PTAs to attend, so I thought, I want a 9-to-5 job that you stop when you go home. And I don't know why I chose speech. It just seemed to appeal to me. And I guess that was as good as anything else, and so I pursued that.
We have one final minute, and I'd like for you to tell us who influenced your life more than any other person or entity.
My mother.
You think your mother did?
Yes, and I think she influenced the life of several other people, because after her death, when we were cleaning out things in her home, we found a shoebox full of letters that she had received from servicemen and men that she didn't even remember having taught, but that she had influenced their lives, and they felt that they had to write and tell her about it. And I think she was a wonderful person.
And taught many boys and girls in Grand Prairie,
Many boys
Texas.
and girls over 51 years.
Wonderful. Beth Ray, I want to thank you very much for being with us today. It's been a delight to interview you and let you add to our history, and we want to thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much for asking me.
Wonderful. And this is Ruthie Jackson reminding you that history is as we live and do.